In the shadow of core Chicago's criminal underworld, where authority was never spoken but enforced through fear, Damon Cross existed as a name that rarely needed explanation. He was not known for ambition or public dominance, but for the quiet certainty that followed every situation he touched. When danger appeared, it disappeared. When someone crossed an unseen line, consequences followed without warning. Damon lived like a man detached from emotion, trained by years of betrayal and violence to treat feelings as liabilities. He never negotiated with sentiment, never allowed attachment to guide his decisions, and never gave the world the satisfaction of seeing him hesitate. To most, he was an enforcer of silence, controlled, efficient, and untouchable. Yet in the center of that controlled existence stood one exception: Evelyn Hart. Evelyn did not belong to his world, at least not openly. She moved through elite social circles in New York, presenting herself as a refined professional tied to art consultation and private philanthropic projects. Her life appeared carefully constructed, almost too clean for someone unknowingly walking near dangerous attention. Beneath that polished identity, however, existed a fragmented past that she had buried so deeply even she tried not to revisit it. Damon had known pieces of that truth long before she ever suspected it. He never questioned her about it, never forced clarity, and never demanded explanation. Instead, he observed quietly, understand enough to recognize that some histories were not meant to be spoken aloud. What he did choose to do was far more dangerous than questions. He began removing threats before they could ever reach her. There was no declaration between them, no spoken agreement, and no defined relationship that the world could label. Their connection existed in absence, in what was prevented rather than what was expressed. Evelyn would experience it indirectly. A suspicious inquiry into her background abruptly halted, a threatening figure suddenly withdrawing from pursuit, a pattern of danger that always stopped just before reaching her. Damon never acknowledged any of it, not because he did not feel anything, but because naming it would make it real in a way he could not control. In his world, emotion was not weakness alone. It was leverage for enemies waiting to exploit it. And Evelyn, without knowing it, had already become the one variable he could not afford to lose. The first disruption came quietly. At first, it was nothing more than irregular data traces, background checks conducted under false identities, encrypted searches tied to old records, and financial probes aimed at reconstructing a name that had been deliberately erased. To anyone else, it would have seemed like routine digital noise. To Damon, it was a warning. Someone was searching for Evelyn's past with precision, not curiosity. Without informing her, Damon tightened the invisible structure around her life. Systems that tracked movement were adjusted. Contacts that monitored threats were activated. Entire digital pathways leading toward her identity were dismantled before they could stabilize. From the outside, nothing changed in Evelyn's world. But behind the scenes, her existence was being carefully guarded by a force she never saw. This was where the internal conflict deepened. Damon was not trying to dominate her life, yet every action he took pulled her further into protection she did not ask for. He was not confessing love, yet everything he did resembled devotion shaped by silence. The contradiction became a constant weight. Protecting her meant controlling exposure, but controlling exposure meant hiding truths she deserved to know. Evelyn, unaware of how close danger had begun to circle her, started noticing fractures in reality. Records she expected to exist were missing. Messages she had sent appeared delayed or altered. Certain people she had recently interacted with no longer responded, as if they had been erased from her path entirely. It felt less like coincidence and more like something intelligent was shaping her environment without permission. Damon never explained why, because explaining would mean revealing the scale of what was coming, and the reason her life could never be ordinary again. That same night, in a secured underground monitoring facility, a decrypted file appeared on a restricted terminal. The system flagged it as impossible data, something that should not have survived deletion, let alone reconstruction. Damon stepped closer as the screen stabilized, his expression unchanged but his attention fully locked. The file carried a name Evelyn had not used in years, one that belonged to a version of her life that was supposed to be permanently erased. And in that moment, Damon understood the search for her had already gone far beyond simple discovery. It had reached a point where her past was no longer hidden, only waiting to be claimed. Her past was not forgotten. It had been preserved, reshaped, and turned into something far more dangerous than memory. In certain hands, history was not something that faded with time. It was a weapon, sharpened slowly, kept hidden until the moment it could destroy everything it touched. Evelyn Hart lived under the assumption that she had escaped what she once was. In public records, she was clean. In professional spaces, she was respected. In private circles, she was untouchable. But beneath that carefully constructed identity existed another name, one that belonged to a life she had buried so deeply that even speaking it internally felt like reopening a sealed wound. That second identity had once belonged to a woman moving through a different world entirely, one tied to compromised officials, silent financial transfers, and criminal-adjacent networks operating through political influence. It was not that Evelyn had been part of that corruption directly, but she had stood close enough to witness how deeply it spread beneath systems that claimed to be lawful. And witnessing it had consequences. Powerful individuals never forgot witnesses, even unwilling ones. Damon Cross already knew the full truth of her past. He had known it long before she ever entered his controlled orbit. What made him different was not knowledge, but restraint. He never used it to define her, never let it become leverage, and never allowed it to change the way he protected her. To him, her past was not her identity. It was simply the reason she could never be left unguarded. But knowledge comes with responsibility, and Damon carried that burden alone. The reason Evelyn was being targeted now was not random. A quiet shift had begun within the upper layers of political and financial power structures. Old transactions were being reviewed, buried witnesses were being traced, and names long believed erased were resurfacing in fragmented digital leaks that pointed toward a controlled exposure campaign. Someone had decided her history was no longer safe to keep hidden. The external threat did not announce itself with violence at first. It arrived as precision. Background systems were accessed through indirect channels. Archived data repositories were queried under mass credentials. Financial networks tied to old corruption threads began reconnecting patterns that had been dormant for years. Evelyn felt none of this directly, but she felt its shadow. Her daily life began to shift in ways she could not logically explain. Conversations she had in private seemed to reappear in unrelated places. People who had no reason to know her name began subtly referencing details from her past. Even professional environments started to feel contaminated by unfamiliar attention. It was as if her life was being studied from the outside, line by line, detail by detail. Hook! The most unsettling part was not that she was being watched, but that someone appeared to already understand her life better than she did. Damon's protection network remained invisible, but it was active in ways Evelyn would never fully perceive. Certain digital intrusions were erased before reaching her records. Surveillance attempts were redirected into false pathways. Individuals attempting to trace her history found themselves blocked by layers of interference that had no identifiable source. To anyone analyzing it from the outside, it would have looked like natural system resistance. But in reality, it was deliberate, structured, intelligent, and built around one singular objective: containment of exposure. Evelyn, however, was not entirely unaware. There were moments when she sensed gaps in her reality, missing transitions in conversations, emails that never reached her inbox but were later confirmed as sent, names of individuals she was certain she had interacted with, suddenly absent from all records. It created a growing psychological unease, as if her world was being edited in real time. And Damon never explained any of it. That silence, once comforting in its stability, began to feel different, not protective, but selective, as if he was deciding what version of reality she was allowed to see. Trust, which had never been openly defined between them, began to fracture in invisible ways. Evelyn could not confront what she could not fully prove, yet her instincts were beginning to reject coincidence. The emotional distance Damon maintained no longer felt neutral. It felt intentional. What she did not know was that Damon was not hiding from her. He was shielding her from the exact truth that was now accelerating toward her life. The more the external force advanced, the more his silence hardened into necessity. And somewhere deep within the encrypted network tracking her past, a single file began to circulate through unauthorized channels, containing fragment of a name she had not seen in years, assembling itself back into existence like something refusing to stay buried. Every kill Damon Cross had ever ordered, authorized, or executed carried a pattern that no one in his world had fully decoded. In the criminal underground, violence was common, but consistency was rare. Damon's actions were not random displays of power. They were precise removals of specific threats, as if every target existed for a reason beyond ordinary rivalry. And in truth, they did. Each erased name, each silenced informant, each vanished intermediary had been connected, in some way, to the fragile perimeter surrounding Evelyn Hart's buried identity. Damon never spoke of it, never justified it, and never allowed anyone inside his organization to connect the full pattern. To his men, it looked like routine enforcement. To those paying closer attention, it was something far more unsettling, protection disguised as elimination. Hook. The most disturbing truth was that Damon did not kill to expand power. He killed to prevent her past from ever becoming a present reality. A rival faction operating out of the fractured remnants of a political criminal alliance had begun tracing anomalies in Damon's decisions. They were not interested in him directly at first. Their objective was Evelyn. They believed her buried identity held leverage over individuals far above Damon's reach, making her existence a key to exposing long-suppressed corruption. What they did not anticipate was a level of resistance surrounding her life. Every attempt to approach her records resulted in interference. Every informant who moved too close disappeared from communication networks. And every pathway leading to her history seemed to collapse before it could fully form. Inside Damon's organization, however, something more dangerous was emerging than external pursuit: doubt. Certain members began questioning the pattern behind his actions. Orders that once seemed strategic now appeared emotionally selective. Resources were being redirected without explanation, and a growing suspicion formed that Damon was no longer operating purely for organizational survival, but for something deeply personal. Silas Vale, once his most trusted subordinate, started observing the inconsistencies more closely. He noticed that every suppressed threat, every erased file, and every eliminated intermediary traced back toward a single invisible focal point. Not territory, not power, but a name no one was allowed to speak too loudly. Evelyn Hart. A memory surfaced within Damon that he never acknowledged outwardly, a fractured moment from years earlier when he had first discovered her connection to the corruption network. Back then, she had not been a target. She had been a witness positioned too close to something that powerful men had already agreed to erase. Damon had intervened before her name could be permanently erased from existence. That intervention had not been clean. It had left consequences, bodies, and unanswered questions that still echoed within his organization's internal history. And the deeper truth was that Damon never truly walked away from that night. He only buried it beneath years of control violence. Evelyn, meanwhile, began to feel the weight of his silence differently. It no longer felt like protection alone. It felt like concealment. His refusal to explain anything created distance where trust should have been forming. And with that distance came fear, not of strangers, but the man silently shaping the boundaries of her life. Protective actions that once appeared invisible now began to feel invasive when partially uncovered. She learned that certain individuals she had spoken to had been removed from active records. Entire conversations she remembered having no longer existed in digital trace. It created a psychological fracture where reality no longer matched memory. She could not understand whether Damon was protecting her from danger or controlling her proximity to truth. That uncertainty slowly reshaped how she saw him. What once felt like silent devotion now carried a darker ambiguity. His absence of explanation created space for suspicion to grow, even when his actions continued to prevent unseen threats from reaching her. Emotional distance expanded between them, not through conflict, but through absence of understanding. And somewhere in the deeper layers of investigation tied to Evelyn's past, a classified report resurfaced, one that should have remained permanently sealed within a forgotten case file. It contained a single line linking Damon Cross directly to a murder that had been officially recorded as part of Evelyn Hart's erased history. For the night the truth started burning. The truth about Evelyn Hart was no longer buried. It was scheduled. Within 24 hours, A classified chain of government-linked evidence archives was set to release a sealed corruption file that had been quietly moving through restricted channels for years. Once activated, it would not simply expose her past. It would reconstruct it publicly, piece by piece, until her identity collapsed under official records that no one could legally dispute. Damon Cross understood the meaning instantly. This was not exposure. It was execution through documentation. The evidence archive was not a single location, but a layered system of judicial vaults, private intelligence servers, and government-controlled storage networks. Each layer held fragments of truth that could be combined into a permanent record. Once released, it could not be reversed, only survived. And Evelyn was at the center of it. The most dangerous part was not the file itself, but the fact that it had been prepared long before anyone openly acknowledged its existence. Damon made his decision without discussion. He would enter the archive system directly. It was not a legal breach. It was not even a tactical operation sanctioned by any authority. It was an intrusion into a controlled infrastructure protected by both state-level security and criminal intermediaries who had helped bury Evelyn's past in the first place. Inside his organization, the reaction was immediate and divided. Silas Vale saw it as a point of no return. Others viewed it as instability finally breaking through years of controlled discipline. Damon's authority, once absolute, now met resistance from within. Orders were questioned. Loyalty began to shift. The structure that once moved in silence started producing friction. Damon did not respond to any of it, because his attention was already fixed on the only objective that mattered. Evelyn Hart could not be exposed, and for that, everything else could be sacrificed. As preparation deepened, Evelyn began to feel changes in her environment that she could not explain. Surveillance around her did not increase randomly. It became precise, almost predictive. The world around her seemed to adjust in subtle ways, as if her movements were being anticipated rather than observed. Vehicles appeared at consistent distances. Digital access to her records experienced brief interruptions that left no trace. Conversations she initiated seemed to echo back through unexpected channels later in ways that felt too coordinated to be coincidence. Something was closing around her life, but she could not identify its source. At the same time, Damon became increasingly distant, not absent, but compressed into silence. Every interaction with him felt reduced to necessity. No excess words, no emotional acknowledgement, only control. That absence created a growing psychological distance between them, even when proximity remained unchanged. Evelyn began to sense a contradiction forming, protection that felt indistinguishable from concealment. What she did not see was the cost behind it. To reach the archive, Damon dismantled alliances that had taken years to build. Financial pipelines were cut. Safe corridors were abandoned. Communication channels burned to prevent interception. Each sacrifice weakened his position inside his own world, making him more exposed to both internal betrayal and external retaliation. Silas warned him one final time, but the warning carried no weight anymore. Damon had already moved past negotiation. When he finally breached the outer structure of the evidence network, the system did not respond like a fortified defense. There were gaps, small inconsistencies in security logs, disabled checkpoints, and missing encryption layers that should have been active. Someone had already been inside the system. The realization changed everything. This was no longer a simple infiltration. It was a confrontation with something already in motion. As Damon reached the central access terminal, the final layer opened without resistance, revealing an abnormal state across the entire archive structure. The system had been modified from within, and the status of the evidence chamber containing Evelyn Hart's full history confirmed a final, irreversible truth. It was already compromised before he ever arrived. The deepest betrayal does not come from enemies. It comes from the ones who understand you best, because they know exactly where to strike without warning. For Damon Cross, that betrayal took the shape of Silas Vale, the man who had stood beside him longer than anyone else in his world to control violence and silent rules. Silas was not just a subordinate. He was a witness to Damon's rise, his decisions, and the hidden war he'd been fighting long, before anyone realized there was a war at all. And now, he was the one opening the door for the enemy. The main antagonist, Grant Voss, had finally stepped out of the shadows of political influence and criminal negotiation. He was no longer operating indirectly. He was now openly coordinating with internal fractures inside Damon's organization, turning structure into leverage and loyalty into currency. Silas became the bridge. The betrayal was not impulsive. It was strategic. Silas believed Damon had stopped acting like a leader and started acting like a liability. Every decision tied to Evelyn Hart confirmed his suspicion. In his mind, Damon was no longer protecting the organization. He was protecting a single life at the cost of everything built around him. That justification became the opening Grant needed. Once the internal breach was confirmed, Damon's position collapsed into dual pressure. Externally, criminal networks and media-linked sources began amplifying his name as unstable, dangerous, and compromised. Internally, former allies distanced themselves, unsure whether to follow him in survival or destruction. The shift was immediate and irreversible. Damon was no longer the unseen protector of order. He had become the center of a manhunt operating from both lawless systems and corrupted authority channels. Evelyn, meanwhile, was pulled into visibility she never asked for. Her name began circulating through indirect leaks tied to the larger corruption exposure. News fragments, anonymous reports, and manipulated records started connecting her identity to Damon's escalating violence. To the outside world, she was no longer a hidden past. She was evidence, a target. What made it worse was the misunderstanding forming between them. Evelyn could not see the full scope of what Damon was doing to keep her safe. All she saw were gaps, silence, disappearance, and growing chaos around her identity. To her, it felt like Damon was pulling away at the exact moment her life was becoming unstable. But Damon was not abandoning her. He was containing the damage. Every trace he left behind was being used to frame him more aggressively. Every protective move was being reconstructed as evidence of criminal escalation, and every attempt to shield her was being reversed into proof that she was connected to his actions. Silas ensured that interpretation spread. Trust inside Damon's world collapsed completely. What remained of his organization fractured into opposing interpretations of loyalty. Some believed he had lost control. Others believed he had always been dangerous, only now exposed. Damon stopped trying to correct it, because correction no longer mattered. Only survival of the truth did. He began preparing for a full-scale conflict, not for territory, not for power, but for control of the narrative surrounding Evelyn Hart's existence. Every remaining resource he had was redirected toward one objective, preventing her identity from being permanently weaponized. Evelyn, however, was no longer just protected in silence. She was being watched by the world. And Silas, now fully aligned with Grant Voss's plan, moved deeper into the final stage of betrayal. He carried something Damon had never accounted for, the complete, unfiltered file of Evelyn Hart's erased history, and he delivered it directly into Grant Voss's hands. She stops hiding, and in doing so, she becomes exactly what every hidden system was designed to eliminate, a visible threat with a name, a face, and a story that could no longer be controlled. After days of fragmented truth and growing psychological pressure, Evelyn Hart made a decision that shifted everything. Silence had stopped protecting her. It had only made her life easier to distort from the outside. So instead of retreating further, she chose to step into the only place where her name could no longer be quietly rewritten. A public charity event in New York, high profile, heavily monitored, and politically connected, became the stage where buried history would inevitably surface. What Evelyn did not realize was that the event had already been shaped around her arrival. Grant Voss did not need to chase her anymore. He only needed to let her walk into the structure he had prepared. Every guest list, every security layer, every controlled media presence had been subtly adjusted to ensure one outcome: exposure under pressure. As Evelyn entered the venue, she felt it immediately. Not danger in the obvious sense, but something more calculated. The atmosphere was too controlled, too intentional. Conversations paused slightly longer when she passed. Eyes followed her with recognition that felt rehearsed rather than natural. The psychological manipulation began without words. Fragments of her erased identity had already been seeded into the environment. Subtle remarks disguised as curiosity. Strategic mentions of names she had not heard in years. Glances exchanged between individuals who clearly knew more than they should. It was not direct accusation. It was reconstruction through suggestion. The goal was not to accuse Evelyn. It was to make her doubt what part of her life was real. From the outside perimeter, Damon Cross observed the situation unfolding in real time. He was no longer operating from shadows alone. The collapse of his internal network had forced him into limited visibility. But moving openly came with consequences he could not fully control. And now he had no choice. Evelyn was inside a control trap. Security patterns inside the venue shifted without notice. Exit routes subtly narrowed. Communication channels began failing in isolated sections. What appeared as routine safety adjustments was, in reality, containment design. Damon recognized it instantly. A psychological enclosure. The realization forced him into visible action for the first time in a long while. Remaining hidden would allow the manipulation to complete itself. Revealing himself, however, meant confirming every accusation already being constructed against him. He chose neither outcome. Instead, he moved. Inside the venue, Evelyn's emotional state began fracturing under the weight of controlled exposure. She could feel the shift in perception around her, as if she were being slowly reclassified from guest to subject. Every step deeper into the event increased her isolation, even within a crowd. Then she saw him, not clearly, not fully, but enough to understand she was not alone in what was happening. Damon's presence was no longer invisible. It was fragmented across movement, interference, and interruption. He was not speaking, not explaining, only reacting to the structure closing around her. For the first time, Evelyn understood something she had not allowed herself to accept before. Everything surrounding her safety had always been intentional. Nothing had been random, but understanding did not bring comfort. It created conflict, because stepping into truth meant stepping away from protection. And that protection was now tied directly to the man the world was beginning to frame as her greatest danger. As chaos subtly escalated to a controlled environment, security shifts misfiring, guests being redirected, information leaks spreading through internal systems. The trap fully activated. And in the final moment before escape became impossible, Evelyn was pulled out of sight by forces moving with precision, isolating her completely from the crowd and cutting her off from any visible path back to Damon. One sentence could have ended everything. One declaration. One truth spoken plainly. One admission that would have rewritten every accusation circling Damon Cross and Evelyn Hart. But Damon still could not say it. Not because he did not feel it, but because the world around him had already made words meaningless. Every system was collapsing into controlled chaos. Every alliance he once trusted had fractured into competing interests. And every path forward now required action, not explanation. The final confrontation unfolded inside the control perimeter of the event structure, now fully exposed as a coordinated trap. Grant Voss had arrived through political protection channels, while Silas Vale moved with what remained of Damon's fractured internal network. Each side feeding off the collapsed Damon could no longer contain. Evelyn stood at the center of it, no longer hidden, no longer protected by invisibility. She had become the focal point of every competing agenda, in motion, and Damon chose her. Without announcement, without negotiation, he severed what remained of his authority inside his own organization. Years of structured control, alliances, and influence collapsed as he redirected every remaining resource away from power and toward extraction. In that single act, he removed himself from leadership entirely. Silas understood immediately. This was not strategy anymore. It was abandonment of structure for something no system could calculate. Evelyn saw it too, though not in political terms. She saw it in movement, in distance closed, in the way Damon no longer positioned himself for survival but for her protection alone. There were no speeches, no explanations, only irreversible decisions made in real time. As the confrontation escalated, betrayal inside Damon's remaining circle detonated fully. What little loyalty remained dissolved under competing survival instincts. Grant Voss exploited the fracture instantly, turning internal confusion into coordinated aggression. Security forces that should have been neutral became hostile. Escape routes disappeared. The environment collapsed into control violence. Damon moved directly into it. He did not try to restore order. He did not attempt to reclaim authority. He focused only on reaching Evelyn as physical danger intensified around her position. Every step forward cost him stability, control, and exposure, and when he finally reached her, the damage had already begun to close in from multiple sides. Evelyn did not need words anymore. She saw the truth in how he moved, how every barrier between her and danger was absorbed by his body before it could reach her. There was no declaration, no confession, only a pattern of sacrifice repeated until it could no longer be misunderstood. For the first time, she understood what he had been doing all along, not controlling her life, containing its destruction. The escape began in fragments, broken corridors, failing systems, collapsing security structure. Damon pushed forward despite injury that had already begun to slow his movement. Blood and exhaustion were not stopping points for him. They were costs he accepted without calculation. Evelyn stayed close, not because she was told to, but because she finally understood distance no longer meant safety. Every moment forward felt like moving through a world that was breaking apart specifically to prevent them from leaving together. And still, Damon did not stop, because stopping would mean losing her. And losing her was the only outcome he had never been willing to accept. As they reached the final exit corridor, the structure behind them began to destabilize completely. Internal systems overloaded. Structural supports failed. The controlled environment that had been designed to trap Evelyn collapsed into uncontrolled destruction. Damon pushed her forward one final time, absorbing the last wave of force behind them as the world fractured into collapsing noise and light. And in that instant, as everything broke apart around them, the space between them was violently erased by an overwhelming explosion that separated their paths into chaos. She survives, but the man who made that survival possible is gone. When the controlled structure finally collapsed, Evelyn Hart was pulled out of the destruction zone by residual emergency protocols and fragmented rescue interference triggered by Damon Cross's last operational actions. The explosion that separated them did not just break physical space. It erased all immediate trace of him from every visible system in motion. In the aftermath, Grant Voss's exposed network unraveled rapidly. The carefully constructed corruption chain he controlled, political influence, financial manipulation, and identity fabrication, collapsed under the weight of leaked evidence Damon had forced into circulation before the final breach. Within hours, the exposure spread beyond containment, turning what was meant to be a silent erasure into a public reversal of power. Evelyn's identity, once buried and weaponized, was officially cleared. The records that had defined her as compromised, guilty, or connected to criminal activity were dismantled under verified contradiction. Her name was no longer attached to fabricated confessions or manipulated archives. What remained was fragmented truth, enough to restore her legal identity, but not enough to explain what she had lived through. To the public, it became a redemption narrative, a hidden witness wrongly buried by corruption, a system corrected under pressure. A truth finally surfaced, but to Evelyn, none of it felt like victory, because Damon Cross was missing. No confirmed body, no verified location, no final record of extraction, only fragmented signals, burn channels, and disrupted tracking systems that ended abruptly at the edge of the collapse zone. The man who had been present in every invisible layer of her life was now absent from all measurable existence, presumed dead. In the days that followed, emotional silence replaced chaos. The world moved on quickly, reshaping the event into a resolved scandal. But Evelyn remained trapped in the space between resolution and loss, unable to reconcile her survival with his disappearance. It was then she began discovering what had never been visible while he was still active: hidden protection logs embedded in erased networks, financial pathways redirected to remove threats before they reached her, anonymous interventions that altered outcomes she had never known were in danger, entire timelines of events subtly adjusted to keep her untouched. Each discovery built a clearer picture of a life she had been living without awareness of how many times it had already been saved. And at the center of every trace, the pattern was undeniable. Damon had never simply protected her. He had rewritten the conditions of her survival itself. The emotional realization did not arrive as a single moment, but as a slow collapse of misunderstanding. His silence had never been absence. His distance had never been detachment.